Hello, everyone. My name is Leo. I'm a voice actor for video games and animation, and a host at Lord Party, the podcast, as well as Gom Jabbar, which is all about Dune. I'll say more about those things at the end, but for now, for today, oh my goodness, I get to talk about Shadow of the Colossus. Now, over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to do my best to avoid spoiling any of the sort of juicy details of this game. So if you haven't played it, hopefully you will still be able to play it and get the most out of it. So I am certainly not the first person to gush about this game, and I won't be the last person you ever hear say, oh my god, this is such a good game. But in talking to a lot of people about this game, I might have a perspective that is a little bit different than most. When I think about how much I love Shadow of the Colossus and why, the reasons that come to mind all tie back to this idea of video games as art. Now, for better or for worse, I got my degree in art, so I think about a lot of things with this vocabulary. But in the world of art, there aren't really right and wrong choices. There are stronger, bolder choices, and there are safer, maybe more established choices. And the point of the artwork is then kind of free-flowing between those choices that you're making as the artist. In the context of video games, we can look at weak or safe or standard choices like Battlegrounds games or Candy Crush games or free-to-play premium games, the yearly sports games that come out every year like clockwork, that have just the same mechanics, but maybe slightly different players and maybe different statistics. I don't know. I don't sports. But in the world of video games, Shadow of the Colossus remains, for me, an example of some very bold choices in development. And very quickly, I will say, I'm going to be talking about bold choices and the way that they made the game. I'm going to talk about the soundtrack and how the game sounds and sort of why that left a big impression on me. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of de-gamification, the way that Shadow of the Colossus works with the sort of expectations of us as gamers, as well as responding very briefly to some of the major critiques that I see in the sort of internet universe when you go to the Googles and you type in the search terms. So to start off, I want to talk about bold choices. Now, personally, I don't know about you, but personally, I am starting to fatigue a little bit on certain types of games. And maybe you've heard of these games, the Fortnites, the Candy Crushes, the games that feel like there's a category of games and you can kind of expect how the gameplay is going to work. But Shadow of the Colossus defied so many of my expectations. You know, initially, I thought I knew what I was getting into. I'm playing this speechless, grunting hero who wields a sword and rides his horse into battle with big monsters, and he's saving a damsel. These are all like narrative beats that I'm familiar with because I've played video games and I've read, fables and stuff like that. But Shadow of the Colossus leaves out so much of that familiar, delicious, time-wasty stuff. You enter into this mysterious kingdom. You're given almost no plot, even remotely. The name of the characters are surmised from the instructional pamphlet in the book that used to come with the disc of the video game in the PlayStation 2 version. And now I don't even know. You Google it, I guess, or a friend mentions, oh, his name is Wander. That's crazy. 90% of games, they start the game and they're like, hey, what's up, John? And you're like, well, I guess I'm John. I know my name now. Or they, give you the choice to name your character. No, not only do you not get to name your character, he has a name and you're not told it. What? But this is one of many instances of this world exists and there is plot, there is narrative, and we find out a little bit more about it at the end of the game. But we are not given complete omniscient access to it. We don't even have the perspective on the plot that the main character has. It's like we've kind of warped into this amnesia child as he's going about this adventure. And that's interesting. Whether you love it or hate it, that's bold. That's cool. I don't mind that. There are times when the plot is given to me and I feel like, don't give it to me. Let me find it. Let me discover it. Let me wonder. Let me ask the question. And 5.5 hours into Shadow of the Colossus, if you had tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, that looks like a fun game, what's it about? I could tell you what I was doing, and I could tell you that I kind of had surmised there's this dead girl, and I guess I'm bringing her back. Maybe she's a love interest, maybe she's my sister. Who's to say? I don't know. I'm just killing the big things. And the fact that they so much hold back that information, whether you think it's a good choice or a bad choice, it is a strong choice. And I would take 1,000 games that maybe even I don't like or enjoy with strong choices over 1 trillion games that are boring and vanilla and mild. The next thing I want to talk about is the soundtrack. So when I say the soundtrack, I do of course mean the sort of sweeping orchestral music that plays in the midst of these boss battles. But I also mean very specifically the almost silence between fights that you experience as you are on Agro, the horse, riding to the next big Colossus fight. The whole world reeks of this isolation, this sort of spookiness, this abandonment. There's nothing, and after the first Colossus, you kind of have an idea of how insane and cinematic the battles are going to be. On the way to that fight, you're left with the sounds of Agro's hooves in the sand. You're left with the sounds of the wind, maybe an errant bird, or whatever. You're left with this soundtrack that is built of the world around you. And it's very almost intimate and exposed and real. And then you get close to the battle, you get close to the enemy, you see the Colossus for the first time, and the music starts to swell. Now, I imagine being Wander, standing on that platform and seeing this monster, this insane thing come to life, and I imagine my pulse quickening, I imagine the adrenaline, I imagine the shaking intensity of I have to win, and there's no fucking way I'm going to be able to. Look at this thing. It's like 80 feet tall, and it's got a sword. Like, I have a sword too, but it's basically a toothpick. It's a glorified, tiny little thing. It's the little sword that you stick in the top of a cupcake at like a 5-year-old's birthday party. That's the sword you have. And then it's magic, but whatever. Then you have this thing that's got like a cloud strife massive sword, and you're like, how am I expected to beat this thing in battle? And the answer to that is this frantic, desperate struggle, and you're clambering and you're climbing, and you're never really like super in control. Every time it's this process of discovery, and it's this process of what the fuck am I supposed to do now? And then sometimes the god whispers a hint and it's totally not helpful, right? This experience of being in over your head is visceral, and the music, the sweeping orchestral music with tunes and themes that I still remember, 13, 14 years later, is analogous to the adrenaline, the blood roaring in Wander's ears as he's clinging for his life to the side of this bird as it's screaming through the air. And the music is so beautiful. And when you first see the Colossus, it's small, and then you're on the Colossus, and it's big, and it's wild, and it's cinematic, and then you defeat the Colossus, and it's still again. It's there, but it's still, and then you're back at the temple, and you're back on your horse, and you're back on the journey to the next Colossus, and you're left with the sweaty, breathless anticipation of what the next thing is going to be, whatever it is. And you're left with the sound of hooves in sand, and you're left with wind and an errant eagle and your lonely voice in this big deserted world. The next thing I want to talk about is de-gamification. And I wrote this word and realized it was probably not the right word. So I mostly mean this, that so often in games, we fight the boss, but on the way to the boss, we have 1,000 nameless henchmen who all drop super convenient ammo and items that will surely set you up to beat the big boss. And there is a feeling over many of these video games of progress. You are Link. You're a child in a village. Fast forward 10 hours of gameplay, now you've got ice arrows. You can shoot, I don't know if that works out, but you can shoot magical ice arrows from a it's awesome. You've got choo-choo bombs that, or I don't care what they're called, but you have those bombs that like shoot along the ground. They zoom away. You've got all this cool shit. You've got all this fancy tech. Now compare that to Shadow of the Colossus. You are a young man, you're trying to bring this girl back to life. From the first fight to the last fight, what you have is your ability to hold on to a ledge, to fur, to whatever. You have your sword. You have your bow and arrow to get attention. And you have your horse to get there and to keep you company on these long rides, these long road trips, right? And nothing really changes. You're not given crazy upgrades. You're not given crazy... you don't end up with ice missiles. Sorry to spoil, part of the game. You don't get ice missiles. You just have a new thing that you need to overcome to get to your goal. And all you have is what you brought to this lonely, deserted valley. The last point that I wanted to mention, it goes back to the kind of bold choice, but Shadow of the Colossus, I've never seen a game hold back in narrative delivery as much as Shadow of the Colossus. Now, since then there have been others, like Journey on the PS4, but I was fighting, I think, the last Colossus, and I still had very little idea what the game was about. And that's a bold choice to say, we are going to build a plot, a narrative, and we're not going to tell you more than you need to know. And you might want to know more, and we'll tell you a little bit more, but never the whole picture. Because there's mystery. There's a sense that Wander doesn't really know what's going on. There's a sense that he doesn't have all the answers. Are you even the good guy? Who's to say? I don't know. It's still really hard to say years later. There's a sense that this valley is mysterious, and that mystery is viscerally present as you wonder what the fuck you're doing, killing these big things. Very quickly, before I wrap up, I did want to address one of the major critiques that I see on the internet when I search this and when I talk to people, and that is the difficulty in controls. And I just want to give you another perspective on them. First of all, it's been mentioned that Team ICO intentionally made aggro less easy to control than they could have. Aggro, the lady horse that you're riding most of the game, she has her own intentions. She has her own will. When you are guiding her gently through a forest or around a kind of cliff edge, she will carefully step around things, even if you're not guiding her to do so. Aggro is making decisions as to whether or not she wants to jump off a cliff. Aggro is making the decision of whether or not, she can find a way down a little hill. And whether or not you agree, you're like, I could fucking walk down that. That's cool. That's you. And you actually could, probably. But Aggro doesn't have to. Aggro's her own damn self. So, cool. The other thing I wanted to say about the controls. Now, when I played the game, I discovered, as we all maybe did, that the controls can be frustrating at times, but they're frustrating because I want to do stuff that I've done in other video games, in this video game, and whose fault is that? I'm not going to say it's entirely my fault, but I'm certainly part of that. I have this expectation of my character doing something that my character clearly has never done and may never do. All I can speak to is my experience, but when I played the game, I never felt like I mastered the controls. I never felt like I, 100% of the time, got Wander to do what I wanted him to do. But also, I never felt, as Wander, like I was in total control of the situation. I was battling something so much bigger than I was. I was trying to kill something that I didn't understand, that seemed completely insurmountable, and I had to kill it somehow with my tiny sword. I didn't feel like an in-control master assassin who trained his entire life for this exact controlled moment. Sometimes I yeeted myself off of edges accidentally. Sometimes I gripped and I lost grip and I fell and had to basically very painstakingly make my way back to, forward 2 steps, back a step, right? Those are all things that could happen to a young man who's fighting frantically and desperately, knowing he is so far out of his depth, and yet persisting and trying his best, even if he's not the main character of an Assassin's Creed game. Even if he sometimes accidentally yeets himself off edges, that's okay. He's going to get back up, he's going to do it again. And I felt that. I was just a young man out of my depth, battling monsters. Thank you for listening to my rambling. Again, my name is Leo, and I'm a voice actor for video games and animation, and a host over at the podcast Lore Party, where we talk about the deeper lore and stories and worlds of our favorite video games, and Jabbar, a podcast exploring and celebrating Frank Herbert's Dune, as well as the sequel books, leading up to the movies and TV series coming out this year. So to find out more about these shows, check out loreparty.com or search for Lore Party or Jabbar on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you so much for listening, and happy gaming.